honored to have Fisher here with us. And he's a friend of us, and he's a great LS practitioner. And in 2016, we went to immersion in Seattle, and was the time that we learned really what liberating structure is. So Fisher was part of our learning journey, and we're still learning with him. And so thank you for coming, Fisher. And we have these beautiful people here to learn together and to have some experimentation together. And over to you.
Just a comment.
Thank you.
One comment. We never know what will happen when we have Fisher in the room. So we really don't know what will happen. Just to be clear. Welcome, Fisher. We love you.
Cool. Thank you for inviting me. It's so fun to see some people here on this call that I go way back with, and some other people that are new to me. When Fernando and Carolina were like, hey, do you want to join for these practice sessions? And we played around with topics or ideas. And I think Carolina and Fernando remind me, you both have been, especially you, Carolina, have been really thinking a lot about psychological safety in groups.
Yeah.
Do you want to just share the tiniest bit about how you've been playing around with, thinking through why is that a relevant theme for you lately? Just any context you want to set around that.
Yeah, I can say that I can feel that the world it's going in a way that people are suffering or have a lot of burnouts lately. And so I think the mental health as well, so psychological safety is important, but also the individual. So both the team and the individuals. So then if we can show our vulnerability, and I like this vulnerability thing because it's very important. If you have a space, a safe space to show your vulnerability, you can talk about things. And if you can talk about things, you can ask for help, you can take risks, and you can do other stuff. And so I believe that then the life is better for everyone when we can be ourselves.
Nice. Cool. Part of what and so I'll just share a little bit. So this the theme around psychological safety is one that it playfully provokes me. And some of you know Anna Jackson, who I do a lot of work with. Anna comes out of social work, and some of the settings she's in, she's like, y'all, safety is an illusion. We can never actually create perfect safety. And so she sort of turned it around a little bit, at least for the settings that she works in, from ensuring safety to reducing the perception of risk, which I've always kind of liked that as a framing. It's like, okay, if we can't guarantee safety, can we at least reduce people's sense that they're at risk, or it's a risky situation for them to be in? And if we can do that, does it make it possible for people to then sort of safely take bolder risks in the context of their work? I'm assuming most people that are here do a lot of work with groups. And so part of the lens for today is both your own individual experience within groups, but also how you facilitate or use structure or kind of hold space for groups around this theme of making it safer to take bolder risks. So that's the theme for today. Carolina introduced some additional language that, as always, if the particular prompt we use doesn't work for you, just change it. Just use whatever language or vocabulary is going to make the most sense for you. The sequence we're going to use today is, it's really two separate liberating structures, and we're going to use them independently. One is the discovery and action dialogue, and then the other is a liberating structure that's sort of in development called Tiny Demons, and it's got some other names: Drawing Monsters, Tiny Demons. I'm fond of calling it ooglets, which we can talk about where that came from in a bit. So for people that just joined, here's the slides for today. Discover and Action Dialog. Let's talk the tiniest bit about this, and then we're just going to go right into using it. So Discover and Action Dialog came out of this, I don't know, movement or approach to problems called positive deviance. And the idea behind positive deviance that no matter how difficult a situation is, how complex a challenge is, there's someone or some people somewhere that have figured out a creative, novel way through that challenge. And they might not have the perfect full solution, but they have successfully adapted to that situation, and they are doing something novel and successful. There's some really nice kind of case studies or big stories about positive deviance that if people really care about learning about it can go look up. But the liberating structure version of it really started in infection control in hospitals. And the idea was, we can try and mandate the behaviors that prevent infections from spreading to patients. And those mandates tend to not work that well. So instead, let's engage people in discovering and uncovering some of the novel, successful behaviors that are much easier to integrate than a top-down sort of mandate. And what they found were, in convening people, some really, really simple and kind of profound behaviors. So an example was the orderlies, the people that go and sort of tidy up the rooms and clean and maintain sort of the function of the hospital. Unlike the physicians and the nurses, the orderlies went to the sickest people last. And it was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So all the nurses and doctors just went room to room to room to room, like in a row. And the orderlies were like, well, like if this person has an infection, maybe I should go to them last so that I don't pick up the little germ that they're carrying and then spread it to the healthy person right next to them. So like there was a really simple behavior that came from a very overlooked position in the hospital. Another thing that they discovered was a couple people had figured out very like novel ways to take off their scrubs. And it was this kind of like clever thing where like they almost peeled their scrubs up and over and then like rolled them into a bundle with the gloves at the center. And it was like, oh yeah, like that, just the laundry of a hospital is like one of the big ways that infections spread. And these people who figured out how to take off their laundry in a way that didn't just spray viruses and germs everywhere were like, oh, that was like kind of successful. And so what Discover and Action Dialog is doing is trying to help us find really, really, really small, often overlooked behaviors that positively contribute to solving this very complex, difficult challenge. So that's kind of the background behind it. The structure of it, which we're going to do here in a second, is we'll be in groups of about 5 people, and there's a question sequence that we're going to work through. As a group of 5, you'll want like one person to serve in this role of what's described often as the butterfly catcher. And the butterfly catcher is a full participant, but that person is also trying to kind of gather and collect the key themes or answers or really like the tiny behaviors that get described in the conversation you'll have. So in the slides on slide 9, there's a little bit of guidance for the butterfly catcher. As the butterfly catcher, you don't have to write down everything. You're really looking for just the handful of small, little, beautiful contributions that come up in the conversation. On slide 10 is the question sequence, and I'll put it in chat so everybody has it. Oops, what did I do? There's basically 5 sequential questions that you're going to work through. And for our theme of kind of safely taking bolder risks, the first prompt is, like, how do you know when taking a risk is actually unsafe, unproductive, or potentially harmful? Like, what are the signals that you tune into that let you know, like, this is not a good risk to be taking? The second question is like, what do you do personally? Like, what's your own individual practice around making it safe for people to take bolder risks? And how do you encourage other people to do the same? The third question is like, what are the obstacles? What obstructs you from always engaging in those positive behaviors you just identified? Like, what are the circumstances that interfere with or make it difficult to always create the space for people to be brave, for people to safely take bolder risks, things like that? The fourth question is the one that I would emphasize the most in this sequence, which is, who do you know, like an individual person or maybe a group, where people reliably and consistently safely take these kinds of risks? And what is the specific practice? What are the specific behaviors? Maybe there's a belief system that supports that kind of environment where people feel comfortable to take these kinds of risks that they might not otherwise take. So what are the things that support that set of conditions? And then the final question is kind of like, what ideas would you want to borrow from those folks or those situations? What do you need to try and make them happen? Is there other people that need to be involved or can be tapped to provide support? So that's the question sequence you're going to work through. Each breakout room, and it looks like Fernando's already named them. Each breakout room has a separate slide just below that. So if you haven't opened the slides, sort of slides 10 through 18, you'll just find your breakout room group, your slide, I should say. And then as you're moving through the questions as a group, try and just jot down some notes about what you're describing or uncovering. Any clarifications? Yeah, Fernando.
How much time?
We're gonna have, let's do 35 minutes total for this. So you have some real time to explore these questions. Maybe in the last 5 minutes or so, we'll send a pop-up. So pay attention if you can to the Zoom screen. We'll send a pop-up that asks you kind of at the end of about 30 minutes to move into a debrief of the structure. So moving from like, okay, how did it go to actually answer these questions? What did they do for us? How could you imagine using this sequence elsewhere? So 30 minutes or so to answer the questions, and then about 5 minutes for some debriefing time as a small group. Any clarifications people need about the task at hand? Again, adapt the prompts however you need to. If you don't like the language that I've used, change it. Just come up with a different word or phrase. Okay? All right, we'll see you in about 35 minutes.
Just give the link for Heather. Welcome, Heather. You landed running already. Here we go. Okay.
Here they are.
Here they are.
All right, maybe as your devices are re-arriving, maybe take a moment and look at the other groups, sort of what they wrote down. Gives you a chance to sort of see how other groups responded to those prompts. So let's take a minute and read through them. Oh, one of these made me really laugh. That's pretty good. Put all the powerful people in a room together and give them some meaningless task to stay distracted.
I love
Create
that
the
too.
create the illusion that they're doing something important. Oh, that's funny. All right, let's do a little debrief of this. So let's start with the sort of, I don't know what we call maybe the content debrief, which is any observations about themes or patterns you notice in how people answered these questions? Is there any common sort of thread that you notice, or maybe like I just did, sort of something that stood out to you in particular, within specific questions? Anything just about the answers to these questions that people want to comment on?
Well, actually, we actually burned up a little bit of our time trying to think about what should be the frame for this conversation. I mean, do we want to keep it to a group facilitation situation versus any organizational challenges, that we're helping people are trying to come to an agreement with, or that type of thing. So I think that was a question that came up that was kind of a thing we had to kind of establish before we jumped in.
Totally. Yeah, that's always one of the tricks with groups that don't share a context. Like Discover and Action Dialogue, what's really nice is when the context is very shared, and when it's not shared, you have to sort of do that negotiation. Thanks for mentioning that, Ariel. Other comments?
So we were a group, we didn't negotiate what the context was beforehand. So we had a broad range of contexts. And we spent quite some time talking about how much the facilitator can engage with actually changing the risk, or whether the facilitator is there to help people get a realistic assessment of the risk, and then see how we can help people be brave in the face of risk. And I think especially when you work internationally or interculturally, or with groups who have a very different lived reality, maybe in an organization you don't know, I think that is often more the work than creating something in a room that is different from the reality that everybody will step into afterwards.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah. And the risks, I think each person's going to feel different things as risky as well. It's like in some settings, it's like even speaking up in this room is going to be a risk. In others, it's like what you leave to go do, and the situation you're coming from, as you described, Ava, is like where does the risk live in the group, and helping people understand. Yeah, that's really. Any commentary about this sequence of questions or discovery and action dialogue as a method or tool? Maybe places you could imagine working with it, or using it, or adapting it. Any thoughts about it as a method?
I can share. I would offer that it was sort of multiple versions of the same question, but it was nice because you got to examine that question at different angles, and with an increasing level of, you almost needed more buy-in, right, as you hit each question. Because if you started with, for example, what makes it hard to do this? What makes it hard to create a safe space? That's going to be a bit tougher than if you eased folks into it. Because I noticed with our group, when we got to that question, like everyone was immediately ready to share our gripes about what barriers. So it was cool.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. That sequence is quite deliberate. If you go to slide 6, there's a little explanation of why those questions are in the order that they're in, if that's helpful to anybody, sort of what's the logic of that sequence. But yeah, thanks for sharing that, because it's like, it is pretty deliberate, and sounds like your experience resembled why the questions are in the order that they're in. Cool. Anything else about this as a method or structure that people have comments on before we dip into the last part of this?
I have a question, Fisher.
Yeah, Barb.
About the 5 questions. I just wonder, in the back of my mind, would it be better or worse to focus them more on behaviors as opposed to attitudes? Just a question.
Yeah, so question 4 can be way more behavioral. So like the example of, there's a different example that I was sharing with Fernando and Carolina about using discovery and action dialogue with young physicians around tending to the emotional and spiritual needs of patients. And the young physicians were like, well, how do you know when a patient's emotional and spiritual needs have been, like, well, they're crying afterwards. What do you do? We do nothing for this. What makes it hard? It's intimidating. It's scary. Is there anyone you know who does it? Yes, they all pointed at this one doctor, and they're like, this doctor does it. And they're like, well, what does that doctor do? And they're like, we don't know. We just you just know that Misha takes care of patients differently. So they set up a thing where they followed Misha around and talked to patients afterwards. And it was really, really tiny behaviors that the patients commented on. So one is like when Misha delivered a hard diagnosis, he actually sat close to people and made physical contact with them, like on their forearm, or held their hand when he gave them a hard information. And then the second thing was, after he gave them that diagnosis, he asked them, do you have a spiritual tradition you use to make sense of difficult things? And if people said yes, he connected them to that person. And if they said no, he'd be like, well, would you like to talk to somebody about how to make sense of this? And not guiding them to a particular tradition, just would you like support around talking about this? And so that one was one where they didn't know the behaviors, Barb, up front. They had to really, really study what this person was doing to uncover the small, tiny behaviors that made a difference. So, yeah, it can be nice to sharpen each prompt with a more behavioral lens on it, or focus to it. And certain topics, I think, lend themselves very well to that, and other topics, like this one's kind of a little more vacuous than how are you preventing superbugs from spreading in this hospital? So yeah, this one maybe didn't lend itself as well to really specific behaviors, but it is what you're looking for in this, I will say, is what are the underlying conditions, specific behaviors, specific practices, as well as you can identify them that contribute to the situation.
Thank you.
All right, let's try to do this last structure. We're going to do it kind of quickly. It's mostly just for fun, maybe a little release. Called Tiny Demons. There's other names for it. One is Ooglets, one is Drawing Monsters. This comes from Linda Berry, who's a great cartoonist and is inspired directly by her book called 100 Demons. The Liberating Structure version of this is going to involve you needing a piece of paper. So why don't you get a piece of paper, and you can use art materials, or you can just use a pen and pencil, or whatever you want to draw with is fine. And the first thing to do is you're going to write down a list on one side of the paper. And the list you're going to write down is when you think about risk-taking in groups, maybe groups that you're facilitating or groups that you're part of, what are the things that, as you think about risk-taking, make you worried or uneasy or even queasy about how risk-taking unfolds in groups? either groups you're in charge of, groups you're facilitating, groups you're part of. What are some of the worries that accompany you around risk-taking in groups? And just make a list of those things. You have that list, either set it aside or flip the page over, but you need to kind of keep the list that you just wrote down separate from what we're going to do next. And the next step is I'm going to go to screen share so people can just follow along this way. The next step is to sort of divide your page into 6, which, am I in the right, where are we? Screen share buttons have all gotten different. It's like, I'm not sharing the right things anymore. There we go. You know what? I really need to look at my email. It's better. Yes,
It's right.
So you're gonna like sort of divide your piece of paper, the sort of separate piece of paper, into 6 frames. You're kind of like making a little comic book setup or comic strip setup. You want 6 separate frames. And then in the first frame, or it doesn't really matter where you put them, but you're gonna in separate boxes, you're gonna draw like a straight line, a round shape, a 3-sided shape, a 4-sided shape, a squiggly shape, and then any shape of your choosing. So you'll end up sort of with obviously you don't have to follow these specific shapes, but you're going to end up with something that looks like this. In each of the separate frames, you're going to draw a line, a round shape, 3-sided shape, 4-sided shape, squiggly, and any other shape. Once you have those shapes, you're going to work on turning each sort of shape into a creature. You can do that by adding hair or wings or claws, or if you'd like if you want to keep it as like an abstract monster, you can leave it as an abstract entity as well. So just work on converting each shape that you drew into kind of a creature, a demon, a monster, an abstract being, but give it some life, animate it somehow. So you're going to take each one, and here's some examples if that's helpful, sort of how it can end up looking a little bit. But turn each one. We're going to do this for about 4 minutes, so you're going to work fast. Don't make these perfectly monstrous, imperfectly monstrous. Again, there might be some inspiration if people need it in the Discover and Action Dialogue list about that third question, what makes it hard to always do these positive things. There might be some monsters embedded in those lists if you're needing help thinking about it. You can keep working on your demon drawings if you want, but the last step here, I'll just give you the last step, and then we'll take a minute to finish off. So go back to your list that you wrote down, the list of things, and then figure out which of the items on that list corresponds to which creature you drew and give it a name. You can either directly name it, or maybe the name is inspired by the fear or anxiety. And next to your each creature, figure out which monster it is. What does it correspond to in your list, and give it a little name. And as you're finishing that up, in a moment, we're going to go into breakout rooms of about 3 or 4 people. And if you're comfortable, you do not have to do this. You can, hold up the images and just talk to each other about maybe how the different monsters that you drew show up in your work with groups. And how do you sort of respond to, notice, metabolize those monsters when they appear? Like, how do you deal with them productively or maybe maladaptively? Do you have maladaptive responses to those monsters? So just a little chance, if you want, you do not have to share the actual images and talk about the fears or anxieties they correspond to. And otherwise, just spend some time talking about, like, okay, how do I work with these? How do I respond to these? How do I interact with these creatures that show up in my work? So Fernando's going to move us into breakout rooms for about 9 minutes to talk those things through. And then we'll come back and have about 5 minutes to debrief. We abandon our partners from time to time.
Sorry, Julie in pajama. I pressed the wrong button.
We were still with you.
Were you?
We were there.
We're all compulsive clickers from time to time. It's okay. Sometimes I'll joke with, like, once in a while I'll have like a chief technology officer or somebody that works in like computer security on calls. And I always joke with them. It's like, okay, I found your 5 biggest risks. It's these 5 people that will click on any button that appears on their screen as soon as it pops up. It's like, all right, welcome back. There's not any real like tidy ending to this. If anybody has a comment that they want to share in chat about the tiny demons as a method and what it did or didn't do, or register your complaints about it as a tool, I'm also happy to see those. So any final little thoughts about using tiny demons as a way to work with this topic of risk? And then Fernando and Carolina are going to wrap us up with, Kylie, maybe you had a comment.
I was just going to build on what we talked about, the risk taking in the previous hour, that for me, with several of the groups that I work with, like physicians, it'd be quite a risk to use this with them, the drawing, right? And so then I started thinking about some of the things we talked about earlier, like you know, prefacing it and saying, okay, this might seem flaky, but I'm going to take a risk here. I hope you're willing to take it with me. And, you know, just employing some of those things that we talked about earlier.
I so
Kylie.
appreciate that, Kylie, especially like calling it, this is flaky. That's such a, I love that. It's like, it's not woo-woo. I just like it flaky. That's such a good, more comfortable way. What were you going to say, Sami?
I wanted to ask Kylie why physicians would find it flaky, or you know what?
Have you worked with physicians?
No, I'm sorry.
Yeah. That's all I could say.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Ariel, and then we'll.
I agree with you, Kylie. I think it is a risky one. I think there's certain ones that are more risk-free. Even the first one, like the first exercise or other liberating structures. I do think that Tiny Demons isn't 100% in the bag for all. Like, not everyone is gonna find it illuminating, but some people will. But there are other exercises that seem to get more people, I think. Even though I love to draw, and I think it's fun to get other people to draw too.
Ariel, and then we'll conclude with Fernando and Kelly.
I was just going to say, I found it, the exercise did not align so much with that pre-composed list, but it did create a great, like, Rorschachian kind of experience in that the images it created clued onto other ones. So maybe a suggestion is, one is you could cleave it back to the original list, but one, it has its own value, even on its own, that might emerge from that. So I just thought there's an opportunity there too, of letting it be more open.
Totally. Yeah. Totally. And this was a quite personal version of it. I just adding this in chat. Like, this was about your individual fears or anxieties. You can scale this up. Like, what's a worry you have about the future of medical practice in Vancouver? What's a worry you have about the future of our hospital system or healthcare system? I'm just using that as an example, Kylie. It's not because I'm trying to say you should or shouldn't do this. What's a worry you have about the future of our business, right? You can scale it up so that it doesn't quite feel as intimidating or revealing at an individual level, if that's part of what you're thinking people might be resistant to. So, Fernando, Carolina, what is next for folks to pay attention to?
Over to Fernando.
Hector, yeah, we started the year with Fisher, which is an honor. And next month we'll be with Hector. AI hallucinations, some do's and don'ts in facilitation. So Hector is playing a lot with AI. We are too, and there are some things that we really want to pay attention as facilitators, because we can use lots of things and we must not do lots of things as well. So it will be a nice discussion. Carolina.
Yeah, thank you, Fisher, and thank you everyone for coming. And I think it was so nice. I just love my monsters here. And I think it's so fun to write, to think about it. So thank you for coming, and hope to see you next practice.
Yeah, see you soon. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thanks so much.
Take care all. Thanks very much.